It doesn't start as overthinking. It starts as something small, a moment that feels slightly unfinished, something you said or something you didn't say. Maybe it was the way someone reacted, or the way a conversation ended just a little too quickly. At first, it doesn't feel important. It just lingers quietly in the background, and your brain does what it's designed to do. It goes back to it, trying to make sense of it. So you replay it. You go over the details again. Slowly at first, you tell yourself you're just thinking it through, just trying to understand. And that feels reasonable. It feels productive, like if you stay with it long enough, it will eventually settle. But instead, something changes. The thought stops moving forward and starts circling. You go over the same moment again, noticing slightly different details each time. And without realizing it, you're no longer thinking about it. You're stuck inside it. You begin adjusting things, rewriting what you said, imagining what you could have done differently. You create better versions of the moment, ones that feel more complete. And for a second, that feels relieving, like you're fixing something, but that relief never lasts, because the moment already happened. It can't be changed. Yet your brain treats it like something unfinished, something that still needs to be resolved. And that's when thinking turns into overthinking. Not when the thought appears, but when your mind refuses to let it end. Your brain is not trying to annoy you when it does this. It's trying to protect you. And protection, at its core, is about reducing uncertainty. When something feels unclear, your brain treats it like a loose end, something that might matter later, something that could come back. So instead of letting it go, it holds on to it. It brings it back into your attention and tries to understand it more deeply. You might not even notice it happening at first. The thought just returns, quietly, and you follow it. You start asking questions. What did they mean by that? Did I say something wrong? Should I have handled that differently? Each question leads to another, and the more you engage with it, the more active it becomes. It starts to feel like something you need to figure out, something important that requires your attention. But the clarity you're looking for never fully arrives. Because most of these situations don't have a clear answer. They're built on interpretation, on assumptions, on things you can't fully know. And your brain doesn't like that. It prefers certainty, even if that certainty is imagined. So it keeps thinking, keeps replaying, keeps analyzing, hoping that if it just stays with a thought long enough, it will finally feel resolved. But it doesn't. It only becomes more familiar, and familiarity makes it easier for the loop to continue. Think about how your mind replays conversations, not just remembering them, but reconstructing them. You go back to specific moments, specific words, specific reactions. You replay what was said, but you also start changing it. You imagine saying something slightly different, something better, something that would have landed more clearly. And in your head, it works. The conversation flows better, the response feels stronger, the outcome feels cleaner. Then you go through it again. Another version, another adjustment, and each time it feels like you're getting closer to the version you should have had. But that version doesn't exist in reality. It only exists in your mind. And yet your brain treats it like something worth chasing, as if the more you replay it, the closer you'll get to resolving the discomfort attached to it. What's really happening is that your brain is trying to correct something that can't be corrected. The moment is over, but instead of accepting that, your mind keeps reopening it. It keeps treating it like an active situation, something that still needs input. And because of that, it never closes. It stays available, ready to be replayed again the next time your mind drifts back to it. The more you return to a thought, the more weight it begins to carry, not because it's actually important, but because your brain starts to treat it that way. Repetition creates a sense of significance. Something that was originally small begins to feel bigger, simply because it keeps appearing. And your brain notices that pattern. It starts to assume that if you keep coming back to it, there must be a reason. So it prioritizes it. It makes it easier to access. It brings it forward more often. And that's how the loop strengthens. Not through meaning, but through repetition. The thought becomes familiar, and familiarity feels important. It starts to feel like something you need to resolve, even if there's nothing to resolve. At this point, it's no longer just a thought. It becomes something that feels active, something that pulls your attention automatically. You might not even choose to think about it, it just appears. And when it does, it feels just as real, just as present as it did the first time. That's because your brain has learned the pattern, and now it runs it without needing permission. Overthinking feels like you're making progress, but you're not actually moving forward. It gives you the sense that you're working through something, that you're getting closer to understanding, but in reality, you're staying in the same place. The same thought repeats, slightly adjusted each time, but never resolved, and that's what keeps you inside it. The feeling that you're almost there, that one more pass through the thought will finally make everything clear. Your brain uses that feeling to keep you engaged. It creates just enough variation to make the thought feel active. You notice something new, reinterpret something differently, or imagine a slightly better outcome. And that small shift makes it feel like progress. But it's not. It's reinforcement. Each time you go back to the thought, you strengthen it. You make it easier for your brain to access it again. Eventually, the thought doesn't even need a trigger. It becomes automatic. It appears on its own because your brain has learned that this is something you return to. And when it appears, it carries the same weight, the same urgency, even if nothing has actually changed. That's how the loop sustains itself, not by solving the thought, but by keeping it active. There's also a deeper reason your brain keeps doing this. It wants control. When something feels uncertain, your brain tries to regain control by thinking through it. It analyzes details, replays sequences, and imagines different outcomes. And while you're doing this, it feels like you're taking action, like you're actively working through the situation. But this kind of control isn't real. You're not changing the outcome. You're not affecting the situation. You're only interacting with a memory. And yet, because it feels active, your brain prefers it over doing nothing. Because doing nothing feels like losing control entirely, so it keeps you engaged, it keeps you thinking, it keeps you replaying. Because from your brain's perspective, thinking is safer than uncertainty, even if that thinking doesn't lead anywhere, even if it keeps you stuck. The illusion of control is enough to keep the loop going. And the longer you stay in that loop, the more natural it begins to feel. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. You don't consciously decide to overthink. It just happens. A quiet moment, a small trigger, or even nothing at all can bring the thought back. And when it does, it feels familiar, almost expected. That's because your brain has learned this pattern through repetition. The more you engage with a thought, the stronger the pathway becomes. It's like your brain is creating a shortcut, something that's easy to access, easy to return to. And because it's easy, it happens more often. The loop forms faster. It starts with less effort. Eventually, it doesn't feel like something you're doing. It feels like something that's happening to you. And that's where it becomes frustrating. Because it feels automatic, like you don't have control over it. But the pattern was built over time, through repetition. And anything that's built through repetition can also be weakened the same way. Not by forcing it to stop, but by changing how you respond to it. What makes these thoughts harder to ignore is that they feel personal. They often involve things that matter to you, your relationships, your decisions, how you're perceived. So when they appear, they don't feel like random thoughts. They feel important, like something you need to understand. And because they feel important, you give them attention. You analyze them. You try to figure them out. But that attention is what keeps them alive. The more you engage with a thought, the more your brain reinforces it. It starts to treat it as something significant, something worth revisiting. But most of the time, these thoughts don't actually require resolution. They only feel like they do because your brain keeps bringing them back. It creates the illusion that there's something unfinished, something you haven't figured out yet, when in reality, the only thing that's unfinished is the loop itself. If you step back and observe the pattern carefully, you start to notice something important. The thought itself doesn't really change. It stays within the same boundaries, the same moment, the same questions, the same uncertainty. What changes is how you interact with it. Each time it appears, you treat it like something new, something that deserves attention again, and that interaction is what keeps it alive. When the thought returns, it brings a sense of urgency with it. It feels like something you should engage with, something you need to figure out. So you follow it. You analyze it again, even if you've already done that before. And in doing that, you reset the loop. You give it energy. You tell your brain that this is something worth returning to. But if you don't engage with it, something different happens. The thought still appears, but it doesn't grow. It doesn't expand into a full loop. It stays small, and eventually it fades, not because it was solved, but because it wasn't reinforced. And that's the key difference. The thought isn't what keeps you stuck. Your engagement with it is. Your brain doesn't distinguish between helpful thinking and repetitive thinking. It only recognizes what you engage with. If you return to a thought repeatedly, your brain assumes it's important. It assumes there's a reason you keep going back to it, so it makes it easier to access. It brings it forward more often, sometimes without any clear trigger. That's why certain thoughts feel like they're always there, just beneath the surface. They're not random. They've been reinforced. Each time you engaged with them, you strengthened the pathway. And now your brain treats them as something familiar, something relevant, something that should stay active. This is also why it can feel like your mind is working against you, like it keeps bringing up the same things even when you don't want it to. But it's not working against you. It's following a pattern it has learned, a pattern built through repetition. And that means it can be changed, but not by fighting the thought. By changing how you respond to it. There's also a strong emotional layer attached to overthinking. Thoughts that carry emotion tend to stay longer. They feel more vivid, more real, more important, and because of that, they're easier to recall. Your brain uses emotion as a signal. If something felt intense, it assumes it matters. So it keeps it active, it replays it, it tries to understand it. But emotion doesn't always mean importance. Sometimes it just means impact. A moment can feel intense without being meaningful in the long term. But your brain doesn't separate those things easily. It treats intensity as something worth revisiting, and the more you revisit it, the more that emotional weight builds. The thought feels heavier, more significant, more difficult to ignore. Not because it actually is, but because it has been reinforced over time. The emotion becomes tied to the loop itself, and that makes it even harder to step away from. At a certain point, overthinking stops feeling like something you're doing and starts feeling like something that's happening to you. The thoughts appear on their own. They pull your attention without asking, and when they do, it feels automatic, like you're being dragged into them rather than choosing to engage. But even in that moment, there's still a small space, a moment where you notice the thought before fully entering it. And that space is where the pattern can begin to change, not by forcing the thought away, but by choosing not to follow it. This doesn't feel natural at first. Your brain expects you to engage. It's used to the pattern. So when you don't follow the thought, it feels incomplete, even uncomfortable. But that discomfort is temporary. It's just the pattern being interrupted. And the more often you interrupt it, the weaker it becomes. Breaking the loop isn't about finding the right answer. That's what your brain keeps trying to do. It keeps searching for a resolution that will make the thought disappear, but that resolution doesn't exist in the way your brain expects. Because the loop isn't sustained by a lack of answers, it's sustained by repetition. The more you try to solve the thought, the more you stay inside it. You keep it active, you keep it relevant. And that's why it doesn't go away. Not because it's unsolvable, but because it's being reinforced. The act of trying to fix it is what keeps it alive. So the shift doesn't come from solving the thought. It comes from stepping out of the process entirely, from recognizing that the loop itself is the problem. And once you see that clearly, the need to solve it starts to lose its intensity. When you begin to see overthinking as a pattern instead of a problem, something changes. The thought loses some of its authority. It stops feeling like something you have to engage with. It becomes something you can notice without needing to act on it. And that doesn't mean it disappears immediately. It still shows up. It still tries to pull your attention. But the difference is in how you respond. Instead of following it, you let it pass. You allow it to exist without turning it into a loop. At first, this feels unnatural, because your brain is used to doing something. It expects engagement, it expects analysis, but when that doesn't happen, the pattern begins to weaken. Slowly, gradually. The thought appears less often, feels less intense, and eventually loses the grip it once had. Overthinking isn't a sign that something is deeply wrong with you. It's a sign that your brain is doing what it was designed to do, just in a way that's become excessive. It's trying to understand, to predict, to create certainty. But in doing so, it creates the very discomfort it's trying to avoid. And recognizing that shifts your perspective. It moves the focus away from the thought itself and onto the pattern behind it, because the thought isn't what's keeping you stuck. The repetition is, the engagement is, and those are things that can be changed. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually, through awareness, through small interruptions, through choosing not to follow the thought every time it appears. And over time, that changes the pattern. When that pattern begins to change, something subtle happens. The thoughts don't feel as urgent. They don't pull you in the same way. They still appear, but they pass more quickly. They don't build into full loops. And in that space, even briefly, you experience something different. Not silence, but distance. Enough distance to see the thought for what it is. Just a thought. Not a problem that needs solving. Not something that defines you, just something that appeared and can disappear again. And once you experience that, even once, it becomes easier to recognize the loop the next time it starts. Easier to step back before it fully takes hold. And over time, that's what changes everything. Not eliminating the thoughts, but no longer being pulled into them every time they appear. There's a moment, right before you fall into a loop, that most people don't notice. It's subtle, almost invisible. It's the moment a thought appears, and you decide, without realizing it, to follow it. That decision doesn't feel like a decision. It feels automatic, natural, like something you're supposed to do. But that moment matters more than anything that comes after it. Because once you follow the thought, the loop begins to build. The details start to expand. The questions start to form. And before you know it, you're fully inside it again. But if you catch that moment even briefly, something changes. You see the thought before it turns into a loop. You recognize it as something that's about to pull you in. And that recognition creates a small amount of space. Just enough to choose differently. Not to force the thought away, but to not follow it, to let it sit there without building on it. And that small shift, repeated over time, starts to break the automatic pattern your brain has learned. Another reason overthinking feels so persistent is because your brain confuses familiarity with importance. The more often a thought appears, the more your brain assumes it matters. It starts to treat it like something that needs attention, something that shouldn't be ignored. But that assumption is based on repetition, not meaning. A thought can feel important simply because it's familiar, because you've been through it so many times that it feels like something you should understand by now, something you should resolve. But that feeling doesn't come from the thought itself. It comes from the pattern you've built around it. And once you see that, the thought starts to lose some of its weight. Not because it disappears, but because you stop treating it like something significant. You start seeing it as something that has been repeated, not something that needs to be solved. And that shift changes how your brain responds to it over time. It's also important to understand that your brain doesn't stop a loop just because you want it to. Telling yourself to stop thinking about it doesn't work, because that's still engagement. You're still interacting with the thought, still giving it attention, even if you're trying to push it away. What actually changes the pattern is not resistance, but non-engagement, letting the thought be there without trying to fix it, analyze it, or remove it. And that feels counterintuitive because it feels like you're doing nothing. But doing nothing is exactly what breaks the loop, because the loop depends on your participation. It needs you to engage with it, to feed it, to keep it active. And when you don't, it has nothing to build on. It fades, not instantly but naturally, the same way any thought fades when it's not reinforced. Over time, as you stop reinforcing these patterns, something shifts in how your mind feels overall. There's less urgency, less pressure to figure everything out immediately. Thoughts still appear, but they don't carry the same weight. They don't demand the same level of attention. And in that space, you begin to experience a different kind of clarity. Not the kind that comes from solving every thought, but the kind that comes from not needing to, from being able to let things exist without turning them into problems, and that's what changes your relationship with overthinking completely. Not eliminating thoughts, not controlling your mind perfectly, but no longer being pulled into every loop it creates. Being able to notice, pause, and move on. And once that becomes familiar, the loops that once felt impossible to escape start to lose their hold entirely.